My name is Alara. For most of my life, I've thought of myself as a quiet observer, someone who lives in the gentle watercolor shades of the world rather than the bold oils. I'm a cartographer of feelings more than places, charting the subtle shifts in a room's atmosphere, the unspoken currents that flow between people. I live in Seattle with my husband, Liam, in a small apartment that overlooks the gray, moody expanse of Puget Sound. Our home is filled with books, the scent of fresh coffee, and the quiet, steady rhythm of a life we built together, brick by careful brick. It's a life far removed from the one I was born into, in a small, windswept town on the Oregon coast called Whispering Pines. My childhood home wasn't a place of whispers, but of declarations, most of them centering around my older sister, Serafina. Sarah, as everyone called her, was the sun around which our small family galaxy revolved. She was bright, vivacious, and effortlessly captured the light, while I seemed to absorb it, fading into the background. I don't say this with bitterness, not anymore. It's simply a fact, like the tide coming in and out. It's the geography of my past. I remember my 18th birthday vividly. My father, Arthur, handed me a single, well-worn suitcase he'd found in the attic. "Time to see the world, Alara," he'd said with a gruff sort of finality. "You're a woman now. Go make your own way." There was no party, no tearful farewell. It was an eviction notice delivered with a pat on the shoulder. I packed my few belongings, a knot of something I couldn't name tightening in my stomach, and left. 2 years later, when Sarah turned 18, the house was draped in the solemn air of a state funeral. She'd won a prestigious scholarship to an art institute in California, a dazzling achievement. My mother, Isabel, clung to her at the doorway, her face streaked with tears. "You don't have to go, my love," she'd pleaded. "We can figure something out. Just stay. The house won't be the same without you." The contrast was a chasm I fell into for years, a dark space where I questioned my own worth. I learned to tell myself I was simply different, more independent, less needy. It was a story that helped me survive. I put myself through college, working 3 jobs, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a stubborn refusal to fail. My parents never asked about my studies, never sent $1. But my grandfather, Samuel, did. Every few months, an envelope would arrive, bearing his spidery, elegant handwriting. Inside would be a check for a few $100s, never enough to make me feel dependent, but always enough to be a lifeline. It paid for textbooks when I was broke, for a new tire when mine went flat, for the quiet reassurance that someone, somewhere, was thinking of me. His notes were always brief, a little something to help. "Keep up the good work. Proud of you, Alara." Grandpa Samuel was the architect of my happiest childhood memories. His workshop, attached to the back of the large, cedar-shingled house he'd built with his own hands, was my sanctuary. It smelled of sawdust and lemon oil and the peppermint tea he always had steeping on a small hot plate. He was a master woodworker, and his business, Ellison and Sons Fine Woodworking, was a local institution. He taught me how to identify the grain of oak versus maple, how to hold a chisel just so, how to feel the story a piece of wood wanted to tell. His hands, gnarled and strong, could coax beauty from the most stubborn of materials. In that workshop, I never felt like a shadow. I felt seen. I felt cherished. But life, as it does, creates distance. My job in Seattle led to Liam, and our life together took root. The miles between Whispering Pines and me grew, not just geographically, but emotionally. Phone calls became less frequent. Conversations with my mother were polite and shallow, circling the same safe topics of weather and work. Sarah, after finishing her degree, had moved back home with her husband, into the sprawling house my grandfather had built. My parents were there, too. It had become a self-contained world, one I no longer had a key for. My last clear memory of speaking with Grandpa Samuel was a video call about 3 years ago. He was propped up in his favorite armchair, the light from the window catching the silver in his hair. He looked frail, but his eyes, the same deep blue as the Oregon Sea on a clear day, were still sharp. We talked about my work, his garden, and the persistent clan of squirrels that were pilfering his tomatoes. He laughed, a familiar, wheezing chuckle that warmed me through the screen. After that, A curtain of silence fell. Whenever I asked to speak with him, my mother had an excuse. "He's sleeping, dear. He's had a difficult day. He's just not up for talking." I'd send cards and letters, pouring my heart onto the page, but I never received a reply. I told myself it was old age. I told myself I was being selfish to demand his time when he had so little energy. I accepted the distance because fighting it felt like admitting I'd been forgotten. Then, one rainy Tuesday in April, my mother called. Her voice was brittle, laced with a strange, performative formality. "Alara, your grandfather is turning 90 next month. We're having a small celebration. If you truly wish to see him, this would be the time to come. If you truly wish to see him." The words were a subtle accusation, as if my desire had ever been in doubt. But beneath the sting, a fragile hope unfurled. Maybe this was an olive branch. A chance to reconnect, to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. I booked the flights that same day, a flutter of nervous anticipation in my chest. I thought it was an invitation to come home. I didn't realize I was being summoned as a witness. The drive down the coast from Portland was a journey through a gallery of ghosts. The familiar landmarks, the Tillamook Creamery, the dramatic sea stacks at Cannon Beach, the thick forests of Sitka spruce, all whispered of a past that felt both intimately mine and irrevocably lost. Whispering Pines hadn't changed. It was still a town held captive by the sea, the air thick with the smell of salt and damp earth. My grandfather's house stood on a bluff overlooking the ocean, a handsome, sprawling structure of cedar and river stone. It was a house built to withstand storms. As Liam and I pulled into the gravel driveway, I saw that a party was already in full bloom in the backyard. Paper lanterns, the color of pale blossoms, bobbed in the breeze. A string quartet played a polite, unobtrusive melody. People I didn't recognize mingled on the lawn, holding flutes of champagne and laughing with a practiced ease. My mother greeted us at the door, her hug brief and cool, her perfume overwhelming. "Alara, you made it. And this must be Liam." She smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. They were guarded, assessing. My father was manning the grill, his shoulders slumped in a familiar posture of weary duty. Serafina drifted through the crowd like a queen in her court, her laughter bright and ringing. She waved at me from a distance, a fleeting gesture, before turning back to a circle of admirers. It was all so perfectly, painfully familiar. I was a tourist in my own history. "Where's Grandpa?" I asked, my voice small. "Oh, we're bringing him out in a little while," Isabel said, busying herself with a tray of appetizers. "We have to be careful not to tire him. He's very fragile." Liam, my quiet, observant Liam, put a hand on the small of my back. He's an architect, a man who understands structure and foundation, who sees the stress fractures no one else notices. He stood beside me, his presence a silent anchor in the swirling tide of my anxiety. He took a glass of water, his eyes scanning the crowd, the house, the atmosphere, with a professional stillness. An hour later, a hush fell over the party. My father and Sarah's husband emerged from the house, pushing a wheelchair. In it sat a man I barely recognized. He was thin, wrapped in a thick wool blanket despite the mild afternoon. His white hair was neatly combed, his face unervingly smooth. He wore dark glasses that hid his eyes. A wave of applause rippled through the guests. My mother stepped forward, her voice trembling with carefully rehearsed emotion. "Friends, family, thank you for being here to celebrate 90 incredible years. 90 years of a man who gave us everything. My father, Samuel Ellison." Tears welled in her eyes. Someone behind me murmured, "How wonderful." I stood frozen, my heart a frantic bird beating against my ribs. I waved, a small, hesitant motion. The man in the wheelchair didn't respond. His head was tilted slightly, as if listening to something far away. I told myself it was dementia. I told myself it was the medication. I told myself the stories I needed to hear to make the world make sense. I felt a nudge at my elbow. It was Liam. He was staring intently at the man in the wheelchair, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away. He just kept looking, his gaze forensic. My mother finished her toast, her voice thick with a sorrow that felt both profound and hollow. The quartet began to play again. People moved forward to offer their birthday wishes, but my mother and sister formed a protective barrier, accepting congratulations on his behalf. "He's too tired to talk much," they'd say with sad smiles. "But he feels the love." That's when Liam leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear. His voice was low and urgent, a stark contrast to the gentle music. "Alara, get your purse. We're leaving." I blinked, pulling back to look at him. "What?" "Liam, we just got here." I haven't even spoken to him. "Trust me," he said, his eyes now fixed on me, dark and serious. "Go inside, get your things from the guest room. Walk, don't run. Act like nothing is wrong." A nervous laugh escaped me. "You're being so dramatic. What's going on?" He took my hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "Please, Alara. Just do it. I'll meet you at the car." The certainty in his voice was terrifying. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an instruction from someone who had seen a building's foundation crack and knew it was about to collapse. My blood ran cold. I glanced back at the man in the wheelchair. He was still sitting in precisely the same position, his hands resting placidly on the armrests, like props in a play. My mind raced. If Liam was wrong, this would be the most mortifying moment of my life, a spectacular confirmation of all the things my family believed about me, that I was unstable, dramatic, always looking for a reason to be difficult. But if he was right, I nodded, a single, jerky movement. I turned and walked toward the house, my legs feeling like they were moving through water. I smiled at a woman who smiled at me. I murmured, "Lovely party," to no one in particular. Each step was an act of will. Inside, the house was silent. I ran up the stairs to the guest room, my heart hammering against my sternum. I grabbed our overnight bags, my hands fumbling with the zippers. I didn't stop to think, I just moved. We met at the front door and walked out to our car, which we'd thankfully parked on the street. No one tried to stop us. No one seemed to notice we were gone. Liam unlocked the doors, and we slid inside. He immediately locked them again, the thunk of the mechanism sounding as loud as a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Liam, you have to tell me what's happening," I said, my voice a ragged whisper. He turned to face me, and in his eyes I saw not panic, but a deep, sorrowful certainty. "Alara," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "That man in the wheelchair, that is not your grandfather." The world tilted on its axis. The gentle sea breeze outside the car window suddenly felt like a harbinger of a hurricane. I stared at Liam, my mind scrambling to process his words, to find a logical explanation that would put everything back in its place. "What do you mean?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. "Of course it's him. He's just older. Sick." "No," Liam said, his gaze unwavering. "It's not him. I've spent hours looking at photos of your grandfather. The ones in our apartment, the ones you've shown me online. I'm an architect, Alara. I notice details. Proportions. The way things are put together. The man in that chair, his bone structure is different. The slope of his forehead, the set of his jaw." He paused, searching for the right words. "And his hands. His hands. Your grandfather worked with wood his entire life. You told me yourself. You showed me that picture of him holding your hand when you were a little girl. He had a scar on his left thumb, a little white crescent from a slip with a chisel. You said he called it his permanent moon. The man in that chair has no scar." I closed my eyes, a wave of nausea washing over me. The permanent moon. I hadn't thought about that in years. It was as much a part of him as his laugh or the scent of cedar that clung to his clothes. It might have faded, I argued weakly, desperate for a rational foothold. "People change." "Some things don't," Liam insisted, his voice soft but relentless. And it wasn't just the scar. It was the way he held them. They were smooth, unworked. They weren't the hands of a craftsman. They weren't your grandfather's hands. My breath hitched. A cold, terrifying clarity began to pierce through the fog of my denial. The dark glasses hiding his eyes. The blanket obscuring his frame. The careful, managed distance. The way he never spoke a word. It wasn't about protecting a fragile old man. It was about concealing an imposter. But who is it? I whispered, the question hanging in the silent car. Liam's expression softened with pity. I don't know. But Alara, think about it. Your mother said you could come if you truly wished to see him. Why phrase it like that? Why have they kept you away for 3 years with vague excuses? Why is this party filled with so many people you don't even know? Each question was a stone dropping into a deep, dark well. The ripples spread, disturbing years of settled doubt and quiet hurt. I had always blamed myself, my oversensitivity, my decision to move away. I'd constructed an entire narrative around my own inadequacy to explain their coldness. But what if the story was never about me at all? My uncle, I said, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. My father's younger brother, Daniel. A man I'd only met a handful of times. He was a drifter, always in some kind of trouble, but the family resemblance to my grandfather had always been striking. He was 20 years younger, but with a bit of makeup, a wig, a wheelchair. Oh, God, I breathed, pressing my palms against my eyes as if I could physically block out the horrifying image forming in my mind. Liam, what does this mean? Where is he? Where is my grandfather? The question hung between us, heavy and unanswerable. 100 fragmented memories flew at me at once. Grandpa Samuel letting me use his hand plane, the crinkle of his eyes when he smiled, the quiet pride in his voice when he spoke my name. The man who had been my only real anchor in a turbulent childhood sea. Where was he? Liam reached across the console and took my hand. His was warm and steady. I don't know, Alara. But we can't just drive away. If we're right about this, something is very, very wrong. I think you need to call someone. The police? The word felt alien, a jagged piece of a world I didn't belong in. Call the police on my own family? On my mother, my sister? The thought was monstrous. It was a betrayal of a code I hadn't even realized I lived by. If we're wrong, Liam said, his voice level, then we apologize. We look like fools. We burn that bridge for good. But if we're right, and we do nothing, I don't think either of us could live with that. He was right. The fear of being wrong was eclipsed by a much greater fear. The image of the man in the wheelchair, the hollow performance of it all, solidified into a grotesque certainty in my gut. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deception. My hand trembled as I pulled my phone from my purse. My thumb hovered over the screen, the reflection showing a pale, terrified stranger. I thought of my mother's brittle smile, my sister's distant wave, my father's resigned silence. I thought of the years of lies, the manufactured distance, the slow, cruel erosion of my place in my own family. And then I thought of Grandpa Samuel, of his kind eyes and his scarred, capable hands. He deserved the truth. I deserved the truth. I took a deep breath, the salt-tinged air filling my lungs, and I dialed 911. The minutes that followed were a blur of surreal calm. I spoke to the dispatcher in a low, even voice, explaining the situation as coherently as I could. I'm at my grandfather's 90th birthday party, I said, the words sounding absurd even to me. But I don't believe the man they say is him is actually him. I'm worried. I don't know where my real grandfather is. 2 plainclothes officers arrived within 15 minutes. Their car was unmarked, and they approached us with a practiced, disarming quietness. They listened to my story without judgment, their expressions neutral. Liam corroborated my account, focusing on the physical discrepancies he'd observed. He sounded so rational, so certain, that for a moment, my own panic subsided, replaced by his steady conviction. We'll go have a quiet word with them, the female officer said. Can you wait here? We nodded, and they walked up the driveway and disappeared into the backyard. From our vantage point in the car, we could see slivers of the scene through the hedges. The music had stopped. The cheerful chatter had died down. The party hadn't ended with a bang, but with a slow, suffocating fade. We saw the officers speaking to my mother. Her posture went rigid. She gestured wildly, her face a mask of indignation. My father stood a few feet away, staring at the ground as if he could will it to swallow him whole. Serafina hovered near the wheelchair, her hand on the impostor's shoulder, a tableau of protective devotion. We watched as one of the officers knelt to speak to the man in the chair. The conversation was brief. After a moment, the officer stood up and rejoined his partner. There was more talking, more gesturing from my mother. Then, finally, a quiet, defeated slump in her shoulders. The performance was over. It felt like an eternity before one of the officers walked back to our car. Her face was unreadable. "We're going to need to ask your family to come down to the station to answer some questions," she said calmly. "The gentleman in the wheelchair has been identified as Daniel Ellison, your great-uncle." I flinched. Not my uncle. My great-uncle. My grandfather's younger brother. "Where is my grandfather?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Is he inside? Is he okay?" The officer's gaze softened with a flicker of professional pity. "We don't know, Ms. Vance. Your mother isn't being forthcoming. We've sent a unit to do a welfare check on his last known address, which is this house. For now, we'd appreciate it if you and your husband would also come to the station to give a formal statement." The station was a sterile, impersonal place that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. We were put in a small, quiet room and I told my story again, this time to a detective. I spoke of the slow estrangement, the unanswered letters, the excuses. Every detail that had once made me feel paranoid and overly sensitive now felt like a crucial piece of evidence. It was late when my phone finally rang. It was an unknown number. I answered it, my heart pounding. "How could you?" My mother's voice was a venomous hiss, stripped of all its earlier poise. It was raw, ragged, and full of a fury so profound it vibrated through the phone. "You called the police on your own family. You humiliated us in front of everyone. You fly in here after years of abandoning us, and you do this. Mom, where is he?" I pleaded, tears finally breaking free and streaming down my face. "Just tell me where Grandpa is." "You have no right to ask that," she spat. "You weren't here. You didn't have to deal with any of it. The difficulties. The expense. The decline. We did what we had to do. For him. For this family." "What did you do?" I sobbed. "What did you do to him?" There was a chilling silence on the other end of the line. Then, a cold, final click. She had hung up. We spent the night in a drab motel a few towns over, the synthetic sheets scratching against my skin. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, staring at the water-stained ceiling while Liam held my hand, his silent presence a lifeline in the dark. The question, "Where is he?" echoed in the hollow space where my heart used to be. The next morning, 2 detectives knocked on our motel room door. My first thought was that my mother had been arrested. But their faces were grim, their energy somber. "Ms. Vance," the older detective began, his voice gentle. "Your family has now given a full statement. I'm very sorry to have to tell you this." He paused, and in that small space of silence I knew. I knew before he said the words. "Your grandfather, Samuel Ellison, passed away over 3 years ago." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the scratchy bedspread the only thing holding me upright. 3 years. He had been gone for 3 years. All that time, I had been sending letters to a dead man. I had been asking to speak to a ghost. I had been blaming myself for a silence that had nothing to do with me. They reported he died peacefully in his sleep in March of 2021, the detective continued, his voice a distant hum. They said he didn't want a funeral or any fuss. They buried him privately on the property. We are, of course, treating this as a major investigation. We'll need to exhume the body to confirm the cause of death and formally identify the remains. The words were clinical, procedural. But all I could hear was the echo of my mother's voice. We did what we had to do. They hadn't been protecting him. They had been hiding him. They had buried him in the backyard like a secret and then orchestrated a cruel, elaborate play to pretend he was still alive. The grief was a physical force, a wave that crashed over me, so immense and suffocating I couldn't breathe. It was a triple-edged sorrow, for the death of the man I adored, for the 3 years I had been denied the right to mourn him, and for the monstrous, unthinkable betrayal by the people I was supposed to call family. Liam wrapped his arms around me, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I let myself completely fall apart. In the weeks that followed, the story unraveled in a series of sordid, heartbreaking headlines. It began on local news broadcasts and then, inevitably, spread to the voracious world of the internet. Family fakes grandfather's 90th birthday party 3 years after his death. The tale was so bizarre, so audacious, that it became a viral sensation. My family were painted as ghoulish villains, and I was cast in a variety of roles: the estranged, vengeful daughter, the naive victim, the righteous hero. None of them felt true. I felt like a crater, a hollowed-out space where a life used to be. The official investigation moved with a slow, grinding inevitability. The coroner's report confirmed my family's story in one crucial aspect. Grandpa Samuel had died of natural causes, a heart attack in his sleep. There was no foul play in his death, only in its aftermath. The relief I felt was sharp and painful. He hadn't suffered. He had simply slipped away. That small mercy was a sliver of light in an otherwise impenetrable darkness. The motive for the deception, however, was far from merciful. It came to light with a phone call from a man named Mr. Abernathy, a lawyer from Portland. His voice was kind, tired. "Ms. Vance, my name is Marcus Abernathy. I was your grandfather's attorney and the executor of his will. I've been trying to reach you for some time, but your mother informed me you were unreachable and wished to have no contact." Another lie, another brick in the wall they had built around me. "I'm afraid there is no easy way to say this," he continued gently. "Your grandfather amended his will about 5 years ago. He left his entire estate, the house, the property, the woodworking business and its assets, and the contents of a substantial trust fund to you. Solely to you." I sat on the floor of our Seattle apartment, the phone pressed hard against my ear. The sounds of the city outside, a distant ferry horn, the rush of traffic, seemed to belong to another world. "He stipulated that your parents and your sister were welcome to live in the house for as long as he was alive," Mr. Abernathy explained. "But upon his death, ownership and all assets were to transfer to you immediately." He told them of his decision. They were fully aware of the contents of the will. And there it was. The final, ugly piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just about grief or a twisted way of coping. It was about money. It was about the house. They had hidden his death to hide my inheritance. They had kept him alive on paper so they could continue to live in his house, to spend his money, to control his legacy. My existence was an inconvenience to be managed, and my grief an irrelevance. The fake birthday party hadn't been a celebration of him. It had been a desperate, theatrical attempt to maintain the lie, perhaps for banks, for neighbors, for anyone who might ask questions. And I had been the one person who could expose it all. The legal consequences for my family were severe, though not as severe as I'd secretly hoped. There was no jail time. For failing to report a death, for the years of financial fraud and identity deception, they were given lengthy terms of probation, hefty fines, and community service. My great-uncle Daniel, the reluctant actor in their play, received a lighter sentence for his cooperation. The court issued an order for them to vacate my house within 30 days. I did not speak to them. I did not see them. My mother left one final, bitter voicemail. "I hope you're happy in that big, empty house. You always did know how to take things that weren't meant for you." I deleted it without listening to the end. A month later, Liam and I drove back down to Whispering Pines. The house was empty. They had left it clean, sterile, and devoid of any personal touches, as if they had never been there at all. On the polished surface of the kitchen island, there was a single, folded piece of paper. A note from my sister, Serafina. "I'm sorry, Alara. That's all I can say." I read the words, but they felt like stones, offering no comfort, no real remorse. I folded the note and put it in my pocket, another ghost to carry. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, golden fingers of light across the ocean, I went out to my grandfather's workshop. I slid open the heavy wooden door. The air inside was still and thick with the scent I remembered so well: cedar, dust, and thyme. Everything was just as he had left it. Tools hung in their neat places on the pegboard walls. A half-finished rocking chair sat in the center of the room, its curves smooth and elegant. On his workbench, a fine layer of sawdust covered everything, a blanket of arrested motion. I ran my hand over the rough, scarred surface of the bench. I picked up a block of maple, its weight familiar and solid in my palm. And I thought of the man who had taught me that every piece of wood has a story. My family had tried to write their own story over his, a false narrative of greed and deception. But they couldn't erase the truth. The truth was here, in this room. It was in the tools he'd held, the scent of the wood he'd loved, the quiet integrity of the things he'd built. Liam found me there as darkness fell, sitting on a stool, just breathing in the silence. He didn't say anything, just came and stood behind me, his hands resting on my shoulders. We stood together, watching the last vestiges of light fade from the sky, the rhythmic crash of the waves on the shore below a steady, comforting heartbeat. I don't know what I will do with this house, with this legacy. I don't know if the chasm between me and my family can ever be bridged, or if I even want it to be. The anger is fading, leaving behind a profound and aching sadness. But for the first time in my life, I don't feel like an observer in someone else's story. I feel the solid ground of my own life beneath my feet. The house isn't empty. It's filled with the quiet, enduring presence of the one person who always saw me, who believed in me, who left me not just a house, but a foundation. And on that foundation, I will begin to build.